little bit about our grains. You know, this is something, grains are a source. Obviously, they've been around for a long time. And they are a source of energy, a source of carbohydrate for our body. But a lot of grain has been refined and processed over the years. So the idea now is to kind of, you know, revert back to eating the grains in their whole form, and it maybe even possibly eating grains that haven't been hybridized through modern farming, and getting back to eating more of the ancient species of the grains, so that they're less, they tend to be less allergenic. A lot of times I say that they're less messed with because they haven't been cross-hybridized over the years. And so when we look at grains, we tend to look at them and eating them in their whole form. So one thing that's really kind of cool is that grains have oftentimes more disease-fighting phytonutrients than many fruits and vegetables, and they certainly contain different phytonutrients than fruits and vegetables. So there we go again with getting more variety, and getting, you know, the more variety we have, the more protection we have against any type of free radical damage that can happen in the body. So let's take a look at a couple of things about grains. This is the sort of like, I call this the anatomy of a whole grain. So the grains that we typically see are basically, a grain is like a seed of a plant. It's, you know, we don't call it seed. We typically call it a kernel, or just the grain. But it consists of three different parts. There's the outer part of the grain, which we call the bran, and the bran is where most of the fiber is. And then usually there are a number of different B vitamins and trace minerals in the bran, usually things like calcium and iron and magnesium in the outer part of the grain in the bran. And then right underneath the bran, there's these, we call that sort of the starchy part of the grain. It's called the endosperm. And that's where most of the starch is contained that is in grains. But also there's some of the grain proteins are in there as well. And then we have the germ portion of the grain, which is the little part that's usually located near the bottom part of the grain. And this is the part that it says it's a small nutrient-rich core that contains antioxidants, including vitamin E and B vitamins and healthy fats. So there's usually some healthy types of little small amount of oil in the germ part of the grain. And the germ part is also the part of the grain that, like, if we were to take that grain and plant it in the ground and then give it the right amount of water and light, it should sprout a new, like, you know, it's going to grow a new plant. That's where all the information, the DNA information about that little seed, you know, is contained to grow a whole new one if needed to. So that's basically what a whole grain is made up of. So when you eat the grain in the whole form, you're getting all of the nutrients there. When a grain is refined, like what we call over here the white grain, what is removed is the bran portion, and then the germ portion is also removed. So they do that in milling, like in grain mills. They use machinery to basically strip off the outer part, and then they also strip out the inner part. And usually this is done for shelf life. As you can imagine, if there's a little bit of oil or moisture in here, that's, you know, going to shorten the shelf life of a grain, because the oil could eventually go rancid. And then the bran portion, when it's stripped off, it's, you know, well, if you leave it on there, it's, you know, off also, it, you know, just shortens the shelf life. There's more for, you know, other things to want to eat it if it's intact like that. So like animals or things like that. Bugs would probably want to feed off of it if it's hanging around for a while, like in a warehouse or something. And so the idea of this was, you know, strip off all the things that would make it last, you know, make it degrade faster. And now you have, basically when you strip all that out, you have just the starch part. and some of the proteins. And there are still like a little bit of vitamins and minerals in here, but not much. And so this is then what we've used to grind into flour. And so that's what white flour is. It's just the starchy part and a little bit of protein that is used to make flour. And of course, that flour does have a long shelf life to it as well. But that's, then you can see then that, this is not as nutrient dense as the whole grain would be. So the idea is to eat the grains in their whole form rather than in the form of refined grain. You can take the whole grain and grind it. I mean, we do that all the time. That's what we call whole grain flours. You can take the whole grain and grind it up, and everything is still there. It's just that now it's kind of crushed up. And you can, make it into something. You can make it into bread, or you can make it into pastas, but all the components are still there. So that's the important piece to keep in mind. So when you're reading an ingredient list, this is, kind of taking us back to the ingredient list reading. There are some phrases that do not mean whole grain. And I think a lot of times it's that marketing again. People get confused. Whenever they see the word wheat, they automatically think that that's whole. And I'm not really exactly sure how that all started, but I think that is the consciousness, is that if you just see the word wheat, you think it's whole wheat, but it doesn't. It is wheat. I mean, the grain was a wheat kernel. It's just that now it's been refined. So unless it says whole in front of the word wheat, then it isn't whole wheat. It's refined wheat. So some of these terms that you will see sometimes, like even 100% wheat, that just means that it's only wheat. There's no barley, there's no rye, there's no oat, just wheat. So that's what 100% wheat means. It doesn't mean it's whole wheat. Unbleached wheat flour, that just means that it didn't get bleached. It still got refined, but it didn't get bleached. So bleaching is like probably one of the last steps in the refinement process. Multigrain means there's multiple grains in there. There could be barley, rye, wheat, oats, but it doesn't necessarily mean that all of those grains are whole grains. And then there's a few other different varieties of wheat: semolina, durum wheat. These are all wheat species, but it doesn't say whole in front of it. So that means it doesn't necessarily mean that it's whole. Pumpernickel is a type of rye, but it oftentimes is like pumpernickel bread, for example, is usually a combination of refined wheat flour and the dark rye flour. So it's not a complete whole product. We often see our cornmeal is degermed, which means that the germ portion of the grain, let me go back to this here, it means the germ has been removed. It still has the bran, but the germ has been removed. That's what degermed cornmeal is. So you can, and by the way, you can buy whole cornmeal. That's just something to look for if you're wanting to make cornbread or some other recipe that calls for cornmeal. You can get it. You don't have to get the degermed portion, but that's the most common type. If you go just to the mainstream grocery store, that's the type you'll probably find. And then rice flour is a term that really just means white rice flour. So white rice is similar. You just, the bran is removed and the germ is removed from the rice kernel. And so you just have white rice, and then it's ground up into flour. Bran, sometimes if you take the bran, this is kind of interesting. When you refine the wheat, you take the bran and then you just sell that separately. So, because some people might want the bran, they might want that extra fiber and those extra vitamins that are in it. And same with germ, like wheat germ, for example. But obviously those are just portions of the grain. They're not the whole grain.